Cool. Okay, so that's me. So I'm Tim Brazier, and having a look at the list of people that have joined this evening, some people definitely know me, other people might have heard of me, a bit notorious. I've been known to be called in Sheffield, but for those of you who don't know me, yeah, I'm Tim Brazier, and I'm a designer, and again, for some of those people on the call this evening, you will know me as a designer, but for quite a few others, you will know me in many different other guises. So, and I'd say it's only the last couple of years where I've started to become comfortable, kind of thinking of myself as a designer and talking about myself as a designer, and feeling like I am a designer. And one of the things I want to talk about tonight is kind of how I've got there, and what I really want to do to try and help other people get there if that's where they want to get to, in trying to kind of, as AK said there, trying to challenge the narrative of design thinking, trying to challenge the language that we use and the kind of exclusivity. So the first thing I wanted to say at the beginning of all of this talk is that as a designer, I do have a confession. So I know this evening is all about design thinking, but I kind of hate design thinking. Which is quite a bold statement at the beginning of a talk. But what I really mean about that is I really don't like the term. So I really love the work that I do and the opportunities I've had and the career that I've been able to, I'm very lucky to kind of have at the moment. But the term design thinking is something that really doesn't sit well with me. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in detail about that, but just for starters, it's something that feels quite exclusive. And I don't know if other people have kind of felt that in different career paths as well, but sometimes a career or an industry gets so caught up in the kind of the using the right language and doing the right thing and being the best at what you are, that they get sucked into this thing that it becomes really exclusive. And design thinking is one of those things which I really struggle with, because it feels like there's some sort of superior way of thinking that if you're not a design thinker or you're not a designer and that's not your job title, then you're not kind of worthy because you're not thinking in this special way. So that's the first thing I really wanted to challenge and kind of share, that it's just something that I really doesn't sit comfortably with me, and I try to avoid using that term as much as possible when I talk about the work that I do, and when I am doing the work that I do. So what I'll talk about this evening, so first of all, how I became a designer, so a little bit of background there, then what my interpretation of design thinking is, because I think it's always good to kind of get clarity on the point of view that I'm coming from, because with a lot of things, design thinking, there's loads of different interpretations of it, so kind of set that out clearly at the beginning. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience of design thinking, so how I've applied it to my work and the kind of what I've learned from it and the experience that I've had over the years. And finally, a little bit like Courtney, we've got a few principles at the end there, just things that I use to help me remember to kind of keep myself in check and stop myself from kind of veering into that very exclusive world of thinking I'm in some way superior just because I can put design thinker on my CV. Okay, so how I became a designer, like many people, I was extremely lucky to go to university. And my aim at university was that I wanted a career with computers, nothing more than that. That was kind of the only idea I had. Fell into a software engineering degree, and found out through that the last thing I wanted to be was a developer. Just really wasn't for me. I really enjoyed the creating things and having something to show at the end of it, but the process just wasn't for me, just really didn't sit well. So through that experience, I kind of looked around me and looked what was close to me, and the next thing that was in reaching distance really was project management. So I took a sideways step, took a step just away from development into project management, and kind of worked in that for about 6 years, working my way up from quite a junior member of staff all the way through to kind of managing quite big projects. But again, some of those that are on this call that will have known me during that period, project management was not my strength at all. I didn't enjoy it. I used to be quite anxious about it, hated deadlines, hated budgets, all that sort of stuff, and me being completely responsible for them. So I started to look away from that. And that's where, through the work that I was doing, I saw design and things like user experience design and kind of graphic design and all that sort of stuff, something that I'd kind of lost touch with from growing up. It had kind of almost been, that creativity had almost been taught out of me, and kind of removed from my kind of line of sight, really, in terms of thinking that it might be something that I could do as a career and for work. So as I was starting to kind of move away that way, I ended up with a job title of producer, which means pretty much nothing, but was at best description just a mix between a project manager and a designer, if you could stretch it. And one of the jobs that I had, I'd say when I moved into it as producer, I was probably doing 80% project management, 20% design. And after 3 years in that role, I'd kind of shifted that to the opposite. So about 80% of it was focusing on design, a lot less on project management, which was great. That was like a really big shift for me, because it felt like I'd professionally been able to kind of start to say that I could do that work and be a designer. So the next job that I got was a service designer. Some of you might know that role. It's kind of become more and more popular since the Government Digital Service, so GDS, kind of made it part of their service standard. And I've had a couple of jobs now with that as the job title, which is great because I can feel like I'm a professional designer, all that sort of stuff. But services, products, whatever it is, for me, it's just about being a designer. And that's kind of the calling that I've found. I found that I can be a designer and apply design and what people are calling design thinking to pretty much anything, and feel the value that it adds. So that's where I've kind of found myself after all these years as a designer. So with design thinking, again, talking about my kind of path towards it, I never knew about design thinking until very late into that kind of journey. So it was only when I was asked to do a bit of training about the way we were working on some projects with a client that I kind of researched it a little bit and thought I needed to sound a little bit more like I know what I'm actually talking about, and stumbled across design thinking as something that's obviously been around for decades and become more and more prominent recently. And it was amazing to kind of find that what I was doing and what I found natural had a name and was a real thing that people had kind of done and studied and kind of put out there into the world in different ways. So it was great to discover that. But again, when I started getting into it more and more, it's the language and the kind of exclusivity that I really want to kind of challenge. So just again, to add some clarity, what I'm talking about when I talk about the design thinking process is this kind of typical kind of 5-step process. So the empathize, define, ideate, prototype and test. So I know IDEO kind of promote this and they talk about this a lot. Or you might have also come across the double diamond, this kind of idea that you start off by going quite big and understand as much as you can, and then kind of narrow it down and converge into some specific thing that you want to kind of do or solve, or an idea you really want to kind of progress with and follow. And then you kind of diverge again and converge back again when you start to prototype and test things. So that's what I'm talking about. But like I said at the beginning, the language around design thinking is something that really grates on me. So the first thing for me is empathize. Now, I get empathy, I understand the value of empathy, but we all work in very professional environments. We work in organizations where our time is, for most people, maybe not most, but for some of us, I know our time is booked in. We have dedicated time to work on certain projects and certain tasks. And for me, you can't book empathy in. You can't set time aside. You can't go and book yourself out for an afternoon and go, please don't disturb me because I'm just going over there to empathize, or I'm going to work from home today because I need to do some empathy. It just doesn't work like that. So kind of taking that language away from it, it just feels too far in the distance. It doesn't feel like something tangible that you can kind of grab hold of. So what I'm kind of talking through here now is my understanding of what this means. So for me, empathize, you're just trying to understand. You can't be those people that are experiencing the things and the problems and the frustrations that you're trying to solve, but you can at least get as close to that as possible and trying to understand. Once you've understood a little bit more, and you're not going to understand everything first go round, but once you've started to understand a little bit more, you can then start to pick what you're going to try and tackle first. So what frustrations, what problems, what hurdles, what blockers, what are those first things that you're going to go, right, if we solve this, then it's going to open up a whole new world of problems that we can then go and solve. It might be kind of doing a bit of root cause analysis and going, the first thing we need to solve is this, we need to fix this, and then the rest of the things can be fixed. So essentially all you're doing there is you're deciding where to start. Yeah, the next step, the next logical step that you think at that time that you can take to go through solving a problem or creating a solution for a problem. Ideate, again, that's, I mean, I don't mind empathy, and empathize is a word, but ideate is one word that really grates on me. I just don't understand why we've had to, why this word has kind of been used more prolifically, but you're just coming up with some ideas. Again, it's just that language that makes you think, right, I'm going to have to go and ideate now, and it just doesn't feel natural. It doesn't come natural to me, and from speaking to other people in the past, it just feels quite exclusive, quite a kind of a strange word to be putting on a task that you're doing. So I like to think of it more as just coming up with some ideas, which we can all do. We can all come up with ideas, good ones, bad ones, and as Courtney was saying, this is where you start to get into that kind of quantity over quality part of the process. Once you've got some ideas, you can start narrowing them down, and you can start to prototype. Again, prototype, don't really mind it, but it can feel quite exclusive again to some people. A lot of people, when I've spoken to them about prototyping, they automatically assume they've got to build something, they've got to know how to code and use software. But all you're ultimately doing with a prototype is creating a way that you can find out if your idea is any good, which is where the testing comes in. So the prototype is just a means to the end, and the end being the testing. So you've got some ideas, how do I test them? You create something, and that's all your kind of prototype is. And test, I'm quite happy with test. I don't need to change the word test. I think that's one thing that we're quite happy with. But the important thing after that is to repeat this process. So this process, I've worked in a number of different organizations, different projects, different teams where this has been applied in different ways. So you could think of this as a quite a long project. So it might be a 5-month project, and you might spend a month on each of these tasks. You might spend a month going out and doing all your research and trying to understand before you move on to deciding which bits you want to do first, and then coming up with the ideas, prototyping and testing. Or you could do it in 5 minutes, or anywhere in between. And the 5-minute example I use is, as an individual, you could be doing this, and you could apply this way of working to any given situation. If you ask me, that's kind of my experience of it. So you could be sat at your desk, you could be sat at home, you could be sat in front of the telly, you could be out for a walk or a run. And essentially, if you've got an idea or a problem, you can try to understand it a little bit more. And that trying to understand might be you just having a minute to take a step back and try and think about it slightly differently. It might be that you do a bit of research. You might just Google something quickly, read a Wikipedia page, read a news article, read some quotes from someone. That might be enough to get enough understanding for you to go, okay, so I understand it enough to think that this is what needs solving, or this is the problem that we need to kind of pick first. And then your ideas, you can sit and have a few ideas, jot them down on a bit of paper or on post-it notes. And that can be your prototype, because all you're doing is testing your idea next. And your idea could just be written on one post-it note, and testing it could be by showing it to the person sat next to you, going downstairs and showing it to the people that you live with, picking up the phone, asking someone a question about it, or stating that you've got an idea you think it's going to solve a problem, emailing it to someone. All of that is valid to go through this process. You don't need big teams working in big shiny offices with big white walls where you can stick post-it notes all over it. This is a process, a way of working that you can build into your everyday work and habitually start to think and kind of work in this way. But the important thing is to repeat it, because once you test something, every time you test something, you get some feedback. Someone will react to it in some way. They'll either tell you what they think about it. They'll have a certain body language which tells you what they think about it. They might kind of just make a audible sigh or something like that. There'll be something that you can tell every time you show somebody something. And all you're doing there is you're understanding more, because their feedback will give you more understanding about that problem, about the idea that you've had. So you can kind of loop back into this process. You've got more understanding. You might pick a slightly different place to start. You might throw it in the bin and go, right, I need to think about this from a completely different way. But that understanding kind of loops back in. Your ideas will get sharper, your ideas will get better, because you've kind of rooted out some of those kind of misgivings and those kind of mistakes that you've made in your understanding and your thinking. And again, your prototype might evolve. So you might go from a post-it note to a presentation or a slide deck, or something like that, which kind of evolves your idea. You can test it in different ways with different people, get more understanding, and go back in again and again. Going back to what Courtney was saying, that idea of quantity over quality here. In the early stages, you can loop around this loads of times in a day, in a week, in a month. And as you get more and more understanding, it'll start to slow down, because your ideas will get more detailed. Your prototypes will become more kind of more functional. They'll become more like the real thing, and your testing will be a little bit more involved, because you're going from testing ideas and concepts to testing things. Is it usable? Can people actually complete the task that they're trying to when we do that? So that's my kind of interpretation of design thinking, and for me, how there are loads of different ways that it can be applied, and really that anybody can apply it. There are arguments all over the internet about whether or not everybody is a designer, and there's so many people that say they can be, so many people that are just adamant that you can't be a designer unless you've got some sort of piece of paper that says it and some sort of accreditation or qualification. But for me, it doesn't matter. You don't have to have the job title. If you're working on anything, you're usually trying to solve a problem or come up with an idea or a solution, and you can apply this whether it's yourself or whether it's with your team or whether it's your whole organization. It can be applied in all those different circumstances, in those contexts. So what I wanted to do now is just kind of give you some examples, so kind of bring this to life a little bit and show how it's kind of worked for me. So trying to understand, these are some of the things that I've learned over the years of kind of applying this, and I've kind of got things wrong to understand these things, and that's the kind of the big lesson here, is you will get things wrong. Things won't kind of work. Your ideas sometimes will be great, sometimes they'll be terrible, but you'll realize quite quickly they're terrible, and you'll realize exactly why, and you'll be much better and stronger for that, and your next ideas will be much better. So trying to understand, for me, big part of this is kind of getting away from your environment. There's a couple of quotes that I would reference if I knew where they came from, but the kind of one which is the worst place to solve a problem is from behind a desk. That one that you might have heard. I don't know if I'm quoting that correctly, but the idea that you can't kind of solve a problem just by sitting in your own little world. So get away from your environment. You're not the user, even if you are. That's the other quote that gets bandied around quite a bit. But yeah, if you're going to kind of understand a problem, you need to kind of go and step into their world a little bit. You need to get a lot closer to that problem than you probably are when you sat in front of your computer working away. And my kind of learning on that is I have run so many workshops over the years in fancy offices. I've done all that kind of full floor to ceiling glass rooms, writing on windows, all that sort of stuff, bringing people into our environment. And I have learned things, and it's been great, and it's progressed projects, but kind of contrast that to the relatively small number of hours that I've spent out in places in the community centres, homeless shelters. I went to a traveller site, which I'll talk about in a second, and I've learned so much more from just being there and seeing the place and hearing what's going on and seeing people's body language and getting much better sense. So a couple of examples of that. So these are 3 photos that I've taken while I've been out kind of doing that kind of understanding part of the design process. So the photo on the left, which is kind of a bit of a tent setup. So we were working in Hastings, and we were looking at the idea was that we could help people that were experiencing homelessness access health information, support and services if we put some computers in the day centre. So that was our idea. But before we kind of went ahead with that, we went down and thought we need to understand the problem a little bit more. And by doing that, we met the outreach team that go out at 4 o'clock every morning, search around the town, find all the people that they're aware of that are sleeping rough, make sure they're all right, offer them a cup of tea, that sort of thing. And just by doing that, we realised that, yes, there is a day centre, and yes, there are quite a lot of people that are experiencing homelessness that go to that day centre, but there are also quite a few people that won't go to that day centre, and they're just being excluded by that initial idea. So just by understanding that, we were able to kind of switch our idea, went back through that process, and we ended up trialing giving the outreach team digital devices and kind of Wi-Fi dongles so that they could have a conversation about someone that wasn't feeling well, or they wanted to check whether they were taking their medication in the right way, all that sort of stuff, where they were and not expecting them to come to us. The one on the bottom is a pop-up shop that we set up when we were, same project, when we were looking at how we could use a high street space to get people in a local town down near Bristol to come in and use digital devices to access health information and health support. And what we learned from that, by just going there and trying it for a couple of days, is people won't walk through that door unless they know what, they feel comfortable, they know what's going to be at the other side of that door. So sticking loads of stuff up on there about come and learn how to use IT for your health. No one wants to walk through a door where they think they're going to see a load of digital devices and be kind of felt like an idiot for not understanding how to use them. And no one's going to walk in just to a high street shop to talk about their health. They want to talk to a GP in a very private space. But we got people through the door by understanding that actually they'll come in and they'll have a chat with you if they've got a cheap coffee, and if the coffee's cheaper than Waitrose at the other end of the high street, then they'll walk through that door before they walk down to Waitrose. So again, that just allowed us to understand and the environment, the people, the relationships that they had with the different things in the town, to get people through that door and kind of build something that's become quite a vibrant space in the high street. And the final one on the right, that's a photo I took of a traveller site down in Dorset. And again, one of the ideas was to bring some of that community into the office, into the council offices, and talk to them. But me and my colleague Pete decided that that just wasn't going to fly. So we got in the back of a car with the councillor who took us out to this site. And the building on the right is the community space. And we spent an hour in there with two mums talking about how they might use the internet to find out information about maternity services and kind of information for them if they were pregnant. And within that hour, the biggest thing we learned is that two mums, which when we started, there were two kids in there. By the time we finished their hour, I think there were 7. And the 7 of them by the end were just finding different ways to try and, I think, kill the other ones. Like they were picking up pairs of scissors out the kitchen drawer. One of them's like charged at another one with a mop. And although that sounds like crazy and chaotic, what we learned is that these mums were talking about accessing information. They're going to be doing it while holding a child on their mobile phone, while another 3 or 4 kids are going to be screaming around them, and they're having to deal with that. So we can't be designing things for people sitting down in an ideal world in front of a desktop computer and having the time and the space to research in that way. So just 3 little anecdotal kind of stories of where just going and trying to understand a little bit more has given us such powerful stories and reasons to change the way that we were designing things. Deciding where to start. So this is the kind of step 2. For me, start small, pick something that you think will add value. You'll get to the other things, so you don't have to worry about solving everything at once. You can pick one thing. Don't be scared to pick the tricky problems, because you might learn that they're not that tricky. You might be making loads of assumptions. And a little trick that you might have seen, this kind of how might we trick. So if you're talking about problems, it's really hard to just move from really thinking about problems to thinking about solutions, because you're quite a negative mindset. But if you flip them into questions, then the ideas that you're expected to come up with next are just answers to questions. And it's much easier just to answer a question in loads of different ways and with the quantity over quality kind of approach than it is to sit there mulling over a problem and just see more problems. When it comes to coming up with ideas, again, ideas don't turn up to an appointment. So the whole don't do brainstorms, don't book in the whole company to come and sit down for an hour and expect to solve the world. You've got to give yourself and other people space for ideas to come up with. And as Courtney was saying, that space, that idea of getting those ideas out of your head as whenever you possibly can, but those ideas will happen whenever. Most ideas happen in the shower, apparently, all that sort of stuff. And realize that if we go through this process and we iterate over it, it's not the only chance you're going to get to have those ideas. And as a designer, this is like one thing that really helps me when I realize this is I don't need to know the answer. I don't have to have the solution. My profession, my work is in the process. I'm working with people through that process as well. And it's okay to not know the answer. And in fact, it's quite liberating because you can just be part of that work, part of that group. You can help other people, you can build on other people's ideas, but not feeling the pressure that you have to have the answer and you have to know what's the right answer. We've all seen this, probably all been part of a situation where you get a pack of post-it notes, you all have to stick them up on a wall, which is great, really good way of kind of getting people to share their thoughts and their ideas. But one thing I would always say is the sooner you can, draw something. And I don't mean come up with really fancy diagrams or anything like that, but just visualize things. If you can get something down on paper that people can look at and point at, you'll get a lot more clarity and you'll get people who are in the room understanding the same thing. I've been in too many rooms now where 10 people have all left the room having spoken about something over and over again, and 10 different people think they've all had the same conversation and all know exactly the same thing. And it turns out that they've all left with 10 different ideas and 10 different understanding and thinking about an individual thing. So having something visual and physical for people to point at and look at, I think I mentioned before, like put a red pen down and people will start to pick that red pen up and start to correct your work if you're the first one to get up there and draw something. It's not easy for a lot of people to have the confidence to draw, but as soon as there's something there that's kind of scruffily drawn up on the wall, and there's pens there that are available, people will start to get that confidence. They'll start to correct things and be able to draw their own ideas as well. So creating a way to find out if your ideas are any good. So this was kind of the prototyping part. Again, you don't have to be a developer to create a prototype. And the point of this is the testing. This is about how do I test my idea? How do I get feedback on my idea? And there's a bit of a flippant remark there about no one cares about your fancy lightweight code base or the fancy JavaScript you've used to fake an interaction at this point. And it's true, we care about that because we've done that work, yeah. And that's the thing that we care about, and we want to show the world our work and our craft. But when you're showing it to somebody who's going to be ultimately a user of the thing or the service or the product, then they're not bothered about that. They just want to give you feedback on, is this going to actually solve my problem? Am I going to be able to complete the task that I'm here to do? And again, as I mentioned earlier, start by testing your ideas and concepts, because the more you go around that loop, the more you'll get into the detail of usability and specific interactions. And lo-fi, I'm sure most of you know this, but the lower quality your prototypes, the more feedback you will get. People will comment on bits of paper that you've scribbled on and you've drawn with felt tip pens. They're less likely to tell you if something's shiny on a screen in a browser. If they don't like it, they're less likely to tell you because they can see and they can feel the work that you've put into it. So the scruffier it is, the more feedback you'll get. And then testing, finally, test far and wide. Don't just test with the obvious people. And any test is a good test. There's loads of different ways to test things. There's very formal ways to test things, and they're all great, but that shouldn't put you off just sharing an idea, just putting something in front of anybody, whether it's, like I say, someone who you live with, a parent, a friend, a colleague, anyone, because every time you put something in front of somebody, you will learn something from that and it will improve, and you go back, you'll get more understanding, and you can go back through that process and repeat. So yeah, so don't take feedback as gospel. We can always take feedback to heart, or we can always kind of worry after we've done some testing and go, well, these people said we should definitely make it look like this, and then somebody else told us we should make it look like something completely different. Take the understanding from their context. Why do they think it should be like that versus why someone else thinks it should be something different, and use that to feed your understanding and feed your ideas and refining and getting it right, because people will react with their understanding straight away, but the more you kind of evolve it and they see a different thing but it still helps them solve the same problem or complete the same task, then they'll start to be able to adopt it and understand it themselves. So last couple of minutes, I'll just run through, like I said at the beginning, my design principles, and I've kind of covered most of these, I think, as I've been going through. The first one, which was about understanding, go to where people are, and I know that's really difficult at the moment because we're all in lockdown, but people are online, so we can go to where they're spending their time now, for a lot of people. So it's not something that should be an excuse to not try and understand a little bit more. Try to understand how people are navigating this new world that we're living in at this moment, because the closer you put yourself to where they are, the more understanding, the better understanding you'll get. When you're doing that, so when you're thinking about that kind of understanding and research, a lot of people will worry about this stage and think, oh, I've got to be a researcher, I've got to ask the right questions, I've got to have a survey, I've got to have a set questionnaire and be really prescriptive about how to do this. But in my experience, just starting a conversation is equally as good, if not better. You learn so much by asking someone maybe just a question, how's their day? Follow that question, follow that line of inquiry, and you'll learn so much more about people and the situations there are, their context, their understanding of things, than you will if you're just asking them a question, because they'll just give you an answer and they'll very rarely elaborate on it. But having that conversation, you'll pick up on those little nuances about how people are behaving and experiencing things. When you're doing that as well, especially in the world of digital, we're often designing and building transactional things, but there's way more to the way people are trying to solve problems and complete tasks. There's relationships involved, so try and find and spot those relationships. The relationships they have with people, with places, with brands, with other products and services. All those relationships can help you understand how people are behaving and will interact with your service or your product or the thing that you're trying to solve their problem with. And try and find what they trust. Where is the trust in this kind of relationship with them and you as your organization or your product or your service? Because it won't solve a problem if there is no trust and they don't trust it. And the final thing is, you don't have to do it all. So I've talked about those 5 stages. I've talked about my experience of doing them. We don't all have to be expert designers. We can all pick something out of what I've just talked about, or do one thing. Start with one thing. It's better than nothing, and you can build on that. The more you do it, the more habitual that becomes, the more it'll become second nature, and you'll start to add more and more things to it. So don't feel like if you want to apply design to your work that you have to do everything and do it all. There are so many small things that you can start to do, and over time it will build up. And that's all I've done. That's been my kind of journey to where I have. The small things that I've tried, they've worked or they've not worked, I've learned from it and I've been able to progress. Because if you're doing something, you're not doing it wrong. And I think that's the biggest thing for me, and the biggest fear that I've had to overcome is when you sat on your own, you think, well, I'm obviously doing it wrong. I'm obviously not doing it how everyone else is supposed to be doing it. Everyone else is obviously learnt this and doing it as per the textbook, and I'm not. And there's this constant fear and that kind of imposter syndrome of it. But honestly, if you're doing something, if you're progressing, if you're understanding, if you're going through that process in any small way, you're not doing it wrong, because you're doing something more than nothing. So my challenge to you would be to think about what one thing that you could do tomorrow. If you're going to work tomorrow, if you're working on something tomorrow, what one thing could you do to slightly change the way you're working on something or thinking about it? Could you share an idea? Could you go for a walk and record some voice notes like Courtney was saying? Could you sit with a stack of post-it notes and come up with different ideas to the one that you're working on at the moment? Could you go and kind of do a bit of research, look online, watch some videos, have a conversation with a few more people to get a better understanding? But if you start with one thing, it'll quickly snowball and you'll start to build those habits as you go. That's me. I'm going to stop talking.